really an exciting evening. It's great to see so many friends here and new friends. And thank you all for coming. I'm just curious, how many people here have actually rowed? Wow, okay. And I know we have, let's see, a show of hands, Olympic and national team rowers here. Okay. That's inspiring. I know we have coaches here as well. How many people here have actually rowed a Pocock racing show? Okay. So let's see, how many people have rowed a wood Pocock racing show? Oh, okay. Okay, this is really good. So just a couple of quick thanks before I introduce Jim. First of all, I'd like to thank the folks at the Trinitarian Church here for their hospitality. They have just opened up their doors for us, and there's a fair amount of it to do, as you can imagine, to put on an event like this, to set up the chairs and extend the hospitality that they have. So it's very much appreciated. Debbie Wilson is the church administrator, and she's kind of led the charge in putting this all together. I think there's certainly a homecoming aspect to this. There's a tremendous amount of fondness for Jim because he was senior pastor here along with Beth for many years. But we do appreciate the church's hospitality. And also I'd like to thank the First Parish Church across the street for opening up their parking to us. The Weston Media Center is here. They're actually going to videotape Jim's talk. And I'd like to thank a few Wayland-Weston crew folks who helped to organize this. John Marchioni, who figured out all the online ticketing that we've been doing, and Teresa Farima, who couldn't be here tonight. She's our web guru, and then all of our ushers who are here tonight helping you find your seats. So sort of a team effort. So as I mentioned, this is a homecoming for Jim. And I first met Jim in August of 2000. We were just getting the Wayland-Weston crew team organized for, I'm Chris Mayetta, by the way, I should have introduced myself. Wayland-Weston crew was just getting organized and aiming to get the team started in the fall of 2000. And we had bought, as is typical with new teams, some vintage boats. And one of the vintage boats that we bought was in fact a Pocock, a wooden Pocock. And I was working on it. We were down at the town beach, which is where we're based, which is run by the town recreation department. I was down there one day working on this vintage Pocock boat, and two people came walking by. And they walked up and introduced themselves, and it was Jim and Beth Pocock. And I heard the name Pocock, and I looked down at the name tag of the boat. And I looked back up, did you say your name was Pocock? How do you spell that? P-O-C-O-C-K. Wow. Did you know this boat's named Pocock? He did. So that's how I met Jim and Beth. And we've been friends ever since. And but how this all came about tonight is through a mutual friend of ours, Dan Bakanowski. Like myself, Dan is a Boston University alumnus, rowed at BU. Later went on and started the women's team there, was instrumental in starting the women's team, and actually was president of US Rowing at one point. And Dan is a mutual friend of Jim and myself. And a couple months ago, he said, hey, we talked to Jim recently. I said, no. He said, well, Jim has been finding all this family memorabilia that has to do with the boys in the boat. And he's put together a talk. You should get in touch with Jim and see if he'd like to put on this talk. So that's how we ended up getting in touch with Jim. And we started looking at calendars and thinking about where could we do this, and the church seemed like a great place. So that's how this all came together this evening. And it was really all thanks to Jim's initiative in putting together this information that we're going to enjoy shortly. So Jim was here for 12 years at the church. He now works at Gordon College up in Wenham as counselor to the president up there, and is very much missed here in Wayland. And so I guess I'll turn it over to Jim, and he'll tell us the rest of the story.
Thank you, Chris, and so good to see you all here. And we appreciate, Chris helped organize this thing, but really we put the Wayland-Weston logo on here because you're officially the sponsor this evening, so congratulations to you for having a very successful high school rowing program. And there is that's great. Uncle George used to say there's no better way to train up a young person than to put him in a boat, teach him how to row. You know what? I'm moving over a little bit. Taking this liberty. My name is James Vickers Pocock, Jr. I have two famous names in boat building. The Pocock one you know, the Vickers one I'll tell you a little bit about as we go. I come from a long line of boat builders. My generation and my father's generation, my father didn't build boats, but 4 generations prior to that, and maybe 5, we can go back to the early part of the 19th century. I'm the grandson of Dick Pocock, who built boats exclusively for Yale University for more than 40 years. I'm the great nephew of George Pocock, and who is prominent in the book, as you know. And we Pococks are very grateful to Daniel James Brown, because when he wrote this book, he tells stories in this book that we have known in our family for well over 100 years. But he tells stories, and he's a pretty good storyteller. He tells them, but he doesn't get them all. And some of the stories that he tells in here, he misses some of the important parts. So I'm going to fill in some things that are not in the book. I'm going to correct a couple of inaccuracies that are in the book. And I'm going to tell you some other things that he doesn't even get into. So this is a book that has been released since June 4th, 2013. It has been on the New York Times bestsellers list ever since then. It's being made into a Hollywood movie right now by the Weinstein brothers. They've got it. It had some fits and starts in production, and it's hard to know exactly where it is, but I'm told it is now got a script that they like, and it's in production. And there is also a PBS documentary that has just been released. It was previewed in Boston last week to a bunch of oarsmen. Maybe some of you saw it. And that will be released on August 2nd in conjunction with the Olympics. So this book has also been released in England and Germany under a slightly different name and a little bit of a revision story to apply in those situations. The US still wins, though. This is a picture of the end of the race. The famous race, that's University of Washington. It wins it in the far lane in lane 6. Italy is 2nd, and Germany is 3rd. US beat Italy by 0.6 of a second in that race. 2,000-meter race. I'm going to play you a movie clip. This is a trailer you can find on Daniel James Brown's website. And the trailer is for the book, but the last half of the trailer is the original movie that Hitler's propaganda movie maker, Leni Riefenstahl, made. And as you listen, you know, German is in the background, but this is her original movie. So you're actually watching the race.
In 1936, as the Nazis prepared to stage the Summer Olympics in Germany, 9 working-class boys in the American Northwest nurtured an impossible dream. They came out of nowhere, out of logging camps, dairy farms, shipyards, and small dusty towns. But in 1936, in an old shell house at the University of Washington, they found one another, and together they set on an epic saga. Ahead of them lay the prospect of Olympic gold. They crushed the 2-time Olympic champions at the University of California. They beat the best crews in the East, the well-heeled sons of bankers and lawyers and corporate titans. They took on rowing's elite aristocratic British boys from Oxford and Cambridge and smashed the world's record to win the right to row for gold. Then, in Berlin, the heart of the new Nazi state, the stage was set. On a nearby balcony, Adolf Hitler stood watching. Out on the water, his German boys wore swastikas on their chests. The crowd, 75,000 strong, began to chant, "Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland," and the flag was dropped.
Daneben mit weißem Stirntuch die Italiener, dahinter die Ungarn, neben diesen England, auf der Außenbahn aber führt Amerika. Deutschland kommt auf, Meter um Meter. Zu spät, zu spät. Amerika hat gesiegt. Erster Amerika, zweiter Italien, dritter Deutschland.
Okay, well, this is George Pocock. First inaccuracy I want to correct is his name is incorrectly spelled in James Brown's book and in Ready All, his original biography. His name is George Yeomans Pocock. It has an S on the end of his middle name. And I have his birth certificate, so it proves it. But all of the biographies say Yeoman Pocock. So you can, I don't know if that's ever going to come in handy for you, but you know it. This picture, he's a very shy man. Not shy, but reserved. Never liked having his picture taken. And this picture was taken after an interviewer in his office asked him for a penetrating question, and he had to pause to think of the answer. And as he paused, he looked down the keel of this boat that he was making, and that picture was snapped. And anywhere, if you Google George Pocock, anywhere, that picture always comes up. He was my great uncle. This was his family, and Aaron Frederick Pocock is his dad, and that's Aaron's 5 children. There's not a wife in this picture because Aaron had 3 wives, and 2 of them died in childbirth. George and Dick's mother died just a couple of months after George was born, and Fred remarried, and Kathleen in the center front was from the 3rd wife, and she died in childbirth. So these are all my great aunts and uncles. My grandfather is in the back, Dick Pocock, year and a half older than George, and George is in the back. And that is Lucy, who's the tall one in the rear, and Julia, who's the older one, on the opposite of Fred. And so in our family, we all had multisyllabic names, but they always called them just by 1 syllable. So that was Jew, Kath, and Luce. That's what they were all called. And they all came to America. Everybody but Fred came to America. And Auntie Jew, I knew her. She lived in New York. She lived in the Bowery. And of course, my grandfather Dick, Milford, Connecticut, and George was in Seattle. This is Lucy, Lou. Lucy was a woman's champion in her own right. This is 1912. She had just won a race, a sculling race down the Thames in London. And look at how she was dressed to race this long black skirt and that sweater. And the guy helping her out of the boat, that was her coxswain. She had to drag him around. And she was quite a woman. I want to tell you a little bit about her. She wasn't supposed to win this race. She beat her competitor. They said, oh, that was a fluke. So they restaged the race and she beat her again. So she was the best woman. To show you about rowing, the popularity of rowing in 1912, how many people you think were on the banks of the Thames watching this race? 26,000 watching women row down the Thames in this, and that was her wherry, you know, hardly a racing shell today. Look how wide that thing is. But she won this race at age 24. She followed her brothers to Seattle. She became the first coach of the women's crew at University of Washington. She was also coach of the women's swimming team at University of Washington. But before landing those jobs, the first job she was given was running the mess hall, being the cook, running the kitchen for the men's crew. And she, every morning, would have to go out and buy provisions. And she got in a wherry, a boat that her brother George made for her. Early in the morning, at dawn, she would push off and she would scull 5 miles to Pike Place Market. And she would buy the groceries, she would put them in her boat, and she would scull 5 miles back. Then she would prepare this huge lunch for all of these oarsmen and a big dinner. Standing up on the bank near the boathouse, watching her every morning, she's a 6 foot tall, very handsome, broad shoulder, strong, with a perfect sculling stroke. Watching her scull was a guy who was the chief engineer of the biggest public works project going on in Seattle at the time, and that was the Montlake Cut. So if you've been to Seattle, you know that there's a cut that goes between Lake Union and Lake Washington that, you know, boat traffic, rowing traffic, and pleasure boat traffic goes through. And so this guy, Ed Stillwell, was standing up top, and he watched this magnificent woman doing this every day, rowing off at dawn. And he said, I've got to meet that woman. And he sought an introduction, met her, and married her. And so that's why we have a lot of Pococks on the West Coast with the name Stillwell in there. Magnificent woman. This is a picture of Eton on Thames. This is where the Pocock brothers grew up. You know, I was doing this talk yesterday. As a matter of fact, I had the privilege, the honor of giving this talk to the Yale crew yesterday down at Gales Ferry in New London. They're getting ready for their race this Sunday against Harvard. And the coach found out that I've been doing this talk, so he asked me to come down. And so I show this picture, and there's a guy whooping it up. He's an Etonian. He went to Eton College, which is just behind these buildings to the right. But just off of this was Eton College, which is the elite prep school for the English aristocracy. And their sport in the spring was rowing. And every Etonian boy was expected to be able to know how to scull. And they had their own sculls. And so Dick and George, from age 12 on, were apprenticed by their father, a master boat builder, and taught how to build single shells. And my grandfather would often say that in the springtime you could walk across the Thames from hull to hull with on these single shells. So this was essentially where my grandfather Dick and George grew up. And this is another view a few years later. The river was the main artery of life. I think this is the early part of the last century. This is well over 100 years ago. So livery and cargo, all working oarsmen would work this river. So the taxi cabs were basically oarsmen. What these boys learned from their father, from the other oarsmen, were what they came to call the Thames waterman's stroke. And as George describes it, the greatest amount of effect with the minimum amount of effort. And essentially this is what they taught the oarsmen at University of Washington when they came over here. Because the fact is, I'll tell you this a little bit later, the coaches didn't know what they were doing. They didn't really know rowing. They just read books on it. And Dick and George essentially taught the coaches how to coach, and they taught the oarsmen how to row. And all of the early oarsmen from the early part of the 1900s, all the coaches for all the major colleges came from the University of Washington. They were essentially taught to row by my grandfather and his brother. And this is where they learned how to row. This is where they learned how to build boats. One of the famous stories in our family was of the Sunday activity. They'd work 6 days a week building boats. On the 7th day, on the Sabbath, on Sunday, they would take out a 4. And Fred would be in the coxswain seat with baby calf on his lap. Jew would be the stroke. Luce would be number 3. Dick would be number 2. George would be in the bow. And they would row up and down the Thames. And they loved to find pleasure boats that were out there, you know, with the high deck full of excursion people. And they would race those boats and beat them all the time, much to the delight of the people that were in the excursion boats. You stand on the docks over here in Eton College, and if you've been there, you look across, and that's what you see. That's Windsor Castle. That's the home of the royalty, one of the homes of the Queen, or at the time that they were growing up, the King. And this is the view that my grandfather grew up with. My grandmother, who came over to the U.S., to Canada actually, to marry him, grew up in Windsor. So she was about a mile from the castle. The Pococks, these boys now, my grandfather and his brother, they're 18, 17 years old building boats. They were very well liked by the Eaton boys, and they were commissioned to build them singles. So my grandfather built singles for Anthony Eden, future Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Crown Prince of Siam, the last king of Siam. You remember a famous musical was made about him. Mr. Cunard, who founded a steamship line, and Tom Sopwith, famous World War I flying guy, the Sopwith aircraft, Sopwith Camel. These were all Etonians for whom the Pococks, my grandfather especially, built singles, actually kind of commissioned by their families to do so. This guy, this is a picture from 1871. This man is H.M. Stanley. H.M. Stanley was hired by the Times of London to go find the missing missionary and explorer David Livingstone, who had been missing in Africa for 2 years, hadn't been heard from. And so they looked for the most brave, adventurous explorer they could find, hired this guy, Stanley. First thing Stanley did was he asked for the best boat builder in London, and he was told that would be John Vickers. And John Vickers is my great-great-grandfather, father of Lucy Vickers Pocock, my great-grandmother. So this comes down on my maternal side, which is my middle name. So Stanley went to find Vickers, commissioned him to build a boat which could be taken apart and carried on the back of porters, a sectional boat. It's believed to be, he built the first sectional boat ever built. And there's a drawing of it that appeared in the paper right there. And that has only 5 sections, but the notes that our family has clearly says it was 6 sections. And it describes it quite at length, our notes. It was a clinker boat with lapstrakes, 6 sections. He made bulkheads that were 3 inches thick every 3 feet. He drilled bolt holes and put, bolt holes through that. And then the last thing he did is got a big 2-handed cross-cut saw and cut right down the middle of those 3-inch bulkheads. And so they were 3-foot sections. I still can't imagine a 3-foot section being carried by a porter for any distance. But he used this boat to go find Livingstone, and he also used this boat on a subsequent exploration to find the source of the Congo. Stanley's story is quite fascinating if you want to read it. He's quite an eccentric adventurer. Here's a picture of George, Uncle George, guy that I knew very well. I was 24 years old when he died. And every year of my life I would spend time with him. So he came east every single year. He learned how to row from his dad, age 12. His first race was age 15, which he won. And his dad, Fred, entered him into a race when he was 17 years old at Putney in England. He instructed him, build the boat. No one is ever going to ask you how long it took to build. They will just ask who built it. And in other words, take your time and take care. And he built a mahogany hull with ash washboards, the opposite of the color pattern, color scheme that everybody else had. So it was quite a distinctive boat. So he was entered into this race. There were 58 entries, and it was an elimination race. So you had many, many heats, and it got down to the final 4, and George was in it. And it included the English champion. Now this is a handicap race. So the first rower with the worst qualifying time went off. The second one had he had a 2-second head start, then another 2-second head start, and a final 2-second head start. George was number 3, and the English champion was behind him, a guy named Charles Harding. This race was raced on a Monday. All boat races were raced on a Monday. Why is that? Because Monday was the only day that the horse races were off. And it was a big betting thing, so everybody would bet on the boat races. So people would bet on these, and everybody bet on Harding. His father, Fred, said to 17-year-old George just before he left the dock, he said, here's my advice. And this is a part of the river, you twist it, it's like a head race, there's a lot of turns in it, bridges. And he said this, Harding knows this course blindfolded. This is his native part of the river, and you don't know this part of the river. Keep him directly astern and you'll never need to look around. And if you're an oarsman, you know that looking around, I mean, that'll cost you 1/10 of a second right there. And so he did. He had a 2-second head start, and he beat him by half a length. 17-year-old beating the English champion. He won 50 pounds. This is in 1910, 1909. He won 50 pounds. He got to the dock. His father was elated. His father was a reserved Englishman, but he was almost beside himself, reaching down to hug George, literally lifting out of the boat. And as soon as he got George on the dock, he said, "George, 2 weeks ago, I bet 5 pounds on you at 20-to-1 odds." So, what do you think 100 pounds was worth in 1909? My goodness. So it was a 150-pound day. This picture was taken in 1936. This was after the Berlin Olympics. George and Frances, Aunt Frances, were coming back to the States, and they went through England. They went through Eton. And George saw his father for the last time on this trip. And they visited the old boathouse, and the master of the boathouse said, "George, we still have that single up in the racks. Would you like to see it?" And he said, "Boy, would I." And they got some clothes for him. He changed into some shorts, and he took that boat that he built so many years earlier out. And Frances snapped this picture of him rowing that same scull on the Thames. There's a formal picture of the man who always hated having his picture taken. This is my grandfather, Dick Pocock. George was 6'1", 180 pounds. Dick was 6'5", my grandfather, and 220 pounds. Absolutely perfect specimen, and he was a tremendous champion sculler. Great oarsman. This is a picture of him in his formal portrait of the Doggett's coat and badge, which he won. Tell you about him being tall. He and George were in the Eton Fire Brigade. So, the volunteer firemen. And all the fire brigade was pressed into service in 1909 for King Edward's funeral. So the King of England died, funerals at Windsor Castle, all the royalty of Europe came. And so the fire brigade had to do crowd duty. They were stationed on the side of the road. There he was in his big fire brigade stuff with his big brass helmet that went up to, and they would often tell the story, I heard this story probably 25 times in my life, that Kaiser Wilhelm was marching in the procession from Prussia, and he's marching along, and he sees this big, huge, tall Englishman. He turns like this, looks him down and up, and meets him right in the eye, and then he turns and resumes his walk. So they always wondered what Kaiser Wilhelm thought of this big Englishman. Boy, what could we do with him in Prussia if we got him over there? Dick won that livery, that outfit in the Doggett's Coat and Badge race. The Doggett's Coat and Badge race is the oldest continuing athletic contest in the world, at least in terms of continuing operation. It was started in 1714. It was commissioned by a man named Thomas Doggett, who was an actor who wanted to find the fastest liveryman on the Thames, because he always wanted the best cabbie. And so he wanted to know who is the fastest rower. And so he put up the purse that generated enough income to stage this race every year. And it's raced on August 10th every single year. It's been continually raced. Even the war years have done it. It is raced 5 miles in London from such and such a bridge to such and such a bridge. And the stipulations of the contest are that normal river traffic must not be interrupted. And so it is the 6 best scullers in all of England, and you basically get to the finish line best way you can. You can row this race once in your life, in your 21st year. And Dick, my grandfather, won it. This is Fred, his father, who was starter of this race for 40 years. So he got to put on his fancy duds. And his title was Barge Master of the Company of Fishmongers. And he had the privilege of starting the race. He loved to have that picture taken like that. And there's a posting of the final outcome. Richard John Pocock of Eton won it, and he won 10 pounds. The coat is held by the Rowing Museum, which of late was in Mystic, Connecticut. They have folded up that section. Now it's in somebody's garage in Woodbridge, Connecticut. But that's on loan from our family to the Rowing Museum. The badge that's on the arm is not accurate. That's a facsimile. And this is a picture of the badge that would be on the arm. All my boyhood years, that was hanging on my grandfather's wall. All my adult years, that was hanging on my dad's wall. And my dad died earlier this year, so now it's hanging on our wall. So come on over and see it sometime. This is a picture of Cole Harbour in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1911. By 1911, the boys were on this continent in Vancouver. George intended to go back to race. He was a year and a half younger than Dick. He would have raced the very next year. He intended to go back to race all the way from Vancouver back to London. He was going to do it. But the first job they got was in a sawmill. They had never used power equipment before, and George hit a soft piece of wood, went through and cut off 2 fingers. So he lost these last 2 fingers on his right hand. And so for that reason, he didn't go back. And an old adversary who he'd beaten every time he raced him won that year. In 1910, Fred lost his job. Politics, staff rivalries. He was no longer head boat builder at Eton College. And he went on to being a journeyman boat builder up and down the river. Dick and George knew that they really had no future there, and so they had to make it on their own somewhere. And they had decided they were going to go to Australia because there was a lot of rowing there, a lot of English immigration to Australia. And so they had decided they were going to London to book passage for Australia. A few days before making that trip in to buy their tickets, a man named Charlie Young came by the house. Charlie Young, this is in George's memoirs. And George, by the way, has about 120 pages, single-spaced memoirs that his family persuaded him to write, which he did 5 years before his death. And it's not published. We have a copy, others in our family have a copy, and so this story is in there. Charlie Young comes by the house. He is fortified with strong drink, quote unquote. And George and Dick think that he's fixing to propose to Lucy. So he was all, bolstered. They're sitting around the table in the kitchen, and they tell him, the boys tell him of their plans to go to Australia. And Charlie Young tells them about his brother who was making 10 pounds a week sawing trees in Vancouver. And then he left. He never got up the courage to talk to Lucy. He left. And someone said, drunken men often speak the truth. And on the basis of that visit, they decided to change their plans and go to America. They went to London, they bought passage out of Liverpool over to Halifax, and then the train across the newly minted Canadian Pacific Railway, and they, about 15 pounds, and they $75 today's, and they paid for it with their race winnings. Years later, George's friend sent a clipping from a BBC program. The program was called What's Wrong with English Rowing? And the first thing they said, the first paragraph was, we should never have let the Pocock boys get away. But this is where they wound up, in Vancouver, British Columbia. And if you've been to Vancouver, it's quite a center of British society there. They play cricket, they play rugby, and they row. They started off in sawmills. They started doing carpentry work. They'd never done that before. Finally, the nascent rowing club, Vancouver Rowing Club at the point of Cole Harbour, heard that there were a couple of young guys that could build shells. They gave them a commission for 2 singles. They didn't have any money. They were basically, so they gave them a promissory note for $200 that they were going to pay them. They said, well, we don't have anywhere where can we build these shells? They said, well, we've got this floating workshop down there, and they were eager to get rid of it. We'll sell it to you for $100. So they took their promissory note to a loan shark, got $100 for it, bought this floating workshop, bought supplies, and that was all the $200, and then built those shells. They built those shells, and they were widely praised, and then the orders started to flow in, small boats. And this is where the Pocock brothers started building shells. They had an anchor. They would anchor that thing, but it would rise and fall with the tides. It would drift around with the currents. When low tide went, it would sink down, and oftentimes the logs would stick in the mud. And then the tide would rise, and the thing would lift uneven. One log would stick in the mud. And they said oftentimes water would rush indoors, fore and aft. They would climb up the stairs to the loft where they slept and just wait for the inevitable, wait for the thing to release and the thing to surface like a submarine. The water would flow out. Then they would go back down and resume doing their fine woodworking, you know, building. So that was the floating wood shop. I heard many stories about that, always with a laugh and a wag of the head. One day they looked out the window and saw this man coming rowing to them. It was not a bad day, but this fellow was such a poor oarsman that they thought he was drunk as well. And they realized after a while that he was coming to them. So they got a gaffing hook, they pulled him in, he came on up, and he introduced himself as Hiram Conibear, coach of the University of Washington rowing team. And the boys couldn't believe it. Now George and Dick were proper Englishmen. You know, they would never insult someone. So George very politely engaged him in conversation like this, looking him in the eye, while Dick snuck around behind to sniff his breath to see if he in fact had been drinking. He got behind him and said to George like this. So they figured, oh, he's not drunk. And then they figured, well, he must be who he said he was. And he said, you know, he had an order for 12 8-oared shells down in Seattle. Would they come down to Seattle to build those shells for him? And they determined that he was telling the truth. They said, yes, we will. They sent for their father, Fred, who still didn't have work. And Fred came, book passage, came to Halifax, and he had Luce with him. When he got to Halifax, they had gotten down to Seattle. Conibear said, you know, I thought I had money for 12. I only have money for 1. They cabled their dad, said, you know, told them this story. Said, don't be so hard on Mr. Conibear. Remember, he's an American. That's what he said. So they were snobs, I guess. But he was a track coach. He never rowed. If you go to Washington, the boathouse is named the Conibear Boathouse, and they called the stroke the Conibear Stroke, which they laughed at those days because the oarsmen said the Conibear Stroke changed every single year. But they essentially taught him the Thames Waterman Stroke. And he would, when he was at a loss for how to coach his athletes, he would have Dick and George go out in their singles out in the harbor and just row around, and they say, watch those guys, and, you know, do what they're doing. Conibear took, so this was in 1912. 1913, University of Washington came to Poughkeepsie. There was a long history of Poughkeepsie Regatta. The best crews in the country would come and they would have their race there. Washington finished 3rd behind, I think Cornell won it, Navy 2nd. 1913, they finished 3rd. Everybody thought it was a fluke. Washington thought, boy, we've hit the promise. We have proven we are worthy. The newspaper accounts call it crudely built Western boats. Actually, that boat was better than anything the Eastern cruise. So this was the beginning. Washington realized that they were there on the national stage. By 1917, Conibear died. He actually was climbing a plum tree to pick a plum. He reached, fell, hit his head, and died. The program floundered. Not because he was such a good coach, but he was a tremendous promoter. And so he would talk it up, and he influenced the president, and his promoting rowing is what suffered more than the program. Also in 1917, the World War I had been going on for 3 years, and we were in it by that time. And so economically, things had dried up, and there were no more orders for boats. So the brothers were barely surviving, not having any orders, and one day, they're in their shop, the president of the university walked in with this man and said, Bill, these are the 2 brothers I was telling you about. And this fellow he called Bill saw a finished 8-oared shell there, hull up, and he got down on his hands and knees. He looked up underneath at the woodwork and spent a long time examining it. He said, you know, this is exactly the kind of workmanship that I'm looking for. And he got up, went over to the brothers, gave them his card, and said, come see me as soon as you can. And he left, put on his hat, left, and they looked at his card and said, W.E. Boeing. So this man was the fellow that my grandfather and his brother always referred to as Bill Boeing, their buddy Bill Boeing. They went to see Bill, and this is where his office was. This is the first Boeing aircraft company, and Boeing explained how he wanted to hire him. Now it's interesting, I was doing this talk last summer in the state of Washington. There was a guy in the audience who identified himself as, he was on the staff of the big air museum that they have in Seattle, largely all Boeing stuff. And he said, this very building is the largest artifact they have in that museum. So you can go to Seattle and see Boeing's first plane. It's in the museum. Boeing had an order going for these seaplanes, and he told the brothers, my problem is the pontoons. They're heavy, they're always breaking. Can you design and build 2 of these pontoons? And he gave them the engineer's specs, and they said, yes. How much would they weigh? They did a little calculation. They said they'd weigh 115 pounds each. And Boeing said, if you can deliver me 2 of them at 115 pounds, I will buy you each a new hat. 3 days later, they summoned him to their shop, and they showed him the 2 pontoons they made. Boeing called for a scale. The first one weighed 116 pounds. Second one weighed 114 pounds. But they never got the hats. I did this presentation in the fall up on the North Shore of Boston. Unbeknownst to me, one of the guys in the audience was a Boeing aircraft executive. And he talked to me afterwards. He came up and said, on behalf of the Boeing Aircraft Company, I want to apologize for not getting you those hats. And then he found me 2 weeks later, and he gave me 2 Boeing hats, you know, baseball caps. So I usually have those around. I forgot to put them in the car to bring it down so I could put it on. 98 years later, thank you to Boeing, who finally delivered to a Pocock what was promised by Bill. George and Dick were put in charge of the pontoon shop. They hired 12 people. They were given authority to do that, and ordered to build 150 pontoons. That is George on the right. And that was going to be enough for the planes they were building plus extras. 150, they got to turn out 2 a day was what they got to. 150 were done before the first airframe was accomplished. And George, though younger than Dick, was the more managerially skilled. He could develop the systems, the manufacturing, and whatnot. And Boeing recognized that, and he said, would you please go into the main airframe shop and see what's wrong? And so he did that, and he saw all kinds of manufacturing errors and inconsistencies, and he kind of retooled that shop. George is 27 years old at this point. He was then made foreman of the final assembly plant, knew nothing about aeronautics, but everything about woodworking. And so those planes were built. Then contracts like this came in. Government contracts. This is the, World War I is going on. And George was sent by Boeing to New York City, where there was manufacturing down in Brooklyn, up to Buffalo, New York, where the Curtiss Aircraft Company was, out to Wichita, Kansas, where there's aircraft. Everybody that was manufacturing airplanes, George was sent, this young guy, and Boeing said, make accurate notes about what they're doing. Look for the advantages they have, look for innovations, and make detailed notes. And he did. He wrote up a report on every one of them. And Boeing learned an awful lot, came back and improved things. A contract was given towards the end of World War I for a huge amphibious bomber right there. And it was given to Boeing and to Curtiss. And each of them could build it, and the government would decide which company that they would give a contract to. Boeing built this in 900 hours. Curtiss took 2,400 hours with inferior wood, and the contract went to Boeing. World War I ended in 1918. Boeing's aircraft, his contracts dried up. Of course, with that, he had to cut his workforce down to 30 people, determined he wasn't going to close the shop. try to diversify. And one thing that Dick and George did was they designed this boat for him. They said, let's try to go into the pleasure boat business. So they called this the Sea Sled. They built 10 of them. This was a scow front. This was an inverted V hull. It was a catamaran. This is 1918. Big V8 engine in the back of this thing. And they took a test run to Victoria, Seattle to Victoria, 90 miles. And Boeing and his girlfriend, who was trying to impress, and George and the engineer went, 4 people. They went up at half throttle to break the engine and came back at full throttle. And they came back in 2 hours. So 90 miles in 2 hours, 45 miles an hour. They only sold 3. This was Prohibition time. There was no liquor anywhere. And Dick, my grandfather, said to Boeing, why don't you put an ad in the Sunday paper for these 7 remaining boats and emphasize their speed? By Monday, all 7 were sold for cash. Boeing had no work. The Pococks were still there. They were in charge of the final assembly plant. And so they, the big final assembly plant, no airplanes, just some plans and a couple of 8-oared shells. They just spent their time building shells. And there was a House committee that came from Washington, D.C., looking at wartime aircraft plans to determine who was going to get a contract. And they came to the final assembly building with just these 2 8-oared shells. And these people from the government, from Washington, D.C. And one guy says, the head of the committee, looked at it and said, who built this? And Boeing said, oh, these two brothers that work for us. And the guy says, I wrote at Harvard, I haven't seen quality like this anywhere. And he called for the brothers, and they came and they stood there for 20 minutes talking about nothing about airplanes, all about rowing. And then the other 7 people, all looking at the woodwork and whatnot. So Boeing got the order there. And the Boeing history is with that government order essentially took off. So the Boeing company never looked back. The brothers stayed till 1922. They worked from 1918 to 1922, 5 years for Bill Boeing. They said, our first love is building boats. We have to get back to building boats. And Boeing said, thank you so much. And he could not pay them what he owed them. So how did Mr. William Boeing pay these brothers? He paid them with Boeing stock in 1922. Here now, you get a look at the 2 sides of our family. I'm on Dick's side. Dick had married my grandmother, Jessie. My uncle Johnny was born in Seattle. He sold his stock, and he built a house. George was single, and he figured, what stock? What's this? And he put it away. His family has never sold a share of that to this day. Think of Boeing stock 1922, all the splits and all the dividends of that. It took him quite a while to realize that he was very comfortable, indeed. And this is actually neither in Boys in the Boat nor Ready All. Do you get this? But it's in George's memoirs, and actually Stan's memoirs too, his sons. This is the secret of the dominance. This is one of the secrets of the dominance of the Pocock wooden boats. Because University of California ordered a boat in 1923. George built them in 8. He had no idea how much to charge. He cabled a buddy of his in London, how much do you charge for an 8? And he converted it to dollars. So he said, okay, here's your price. $1,250. $1,250 bucks, 1923. That same 8 sold in 1960 for $1,800. He never had to make the money. He just wanted to build the boats and get them out there. He just basically covered his costs because he had plenty with the income that the Boeing stock was producing. And he had a whole shop of men. He had a whole payroll. As long as he could cover the cost basically with sales. And other boat builders tried to get in Chris Craft. They built fine wooden boats. They tried to get into wooden boat racing shell building. They couldn't compete in price. So this is part, in addition to being the superior boats, which, of course is true. They couldn't compete in price. So George and Brown really never met the man, but he really captures him. Those quotes that head every chapter, and then the kind of the teaching, almost the poetical nature of the guy, he really captured Uncle George. George loved spreading the gospel of rowing. George was a guy who felt that rowing was the best way to build people. And matter of fact, for a certain time, if you've rowed in a wooden Pocock, you know the little blue sticker, right? Pocock racing shells, University Station, Seattle, Washington. But there was a time when those blue stickers said, Pocock racing shells, building boats to build mankind. That's what he said. He would want to, he felt it was the best way to build people. So any school that wanted a Pocock boat, he would build for. Prep schools and colleges, universities. There's a famous story about UCLA wanting to start a program. They ordered 2 8s. And so he called them and said, your 8s are finished, come on and pick them up. They went up to Seattle, and there were 3 of them out there on the dock. They said, we only ordered 2. He said, well, you can't properly start a program with just 2 boats, so I built you 3. Pay me when you can. That's what he always said, pay me when you can. He also, as a matter of fact, I was just talking to a fellow, one of you guys from Dartmouth, who talked about George building a boat and then coming up to Dartmouth to see how the equipment was doing and how the program was going. Every place he sold a boat, he visited. It might take him 5 years, but he came east with UW for the Poughkeepsie Regatta, and he would always come on his own time, sometimes with on the train, but sometimes on his own, and he would always go back on his own path. He would visit every program, stay a couple of days, talk to the coach. How's it going with the program? How's the crew doing? He would ride in the launch. He would comment on the crew. He would find out how his equipment was doing. They loved him. I mean, the man, he just loved rowing, and he single-handedly spread it. My grandfather, by contrast, was a kind of a reclusive guy. He liked nothing better than to be in a shop all by himself building a boat. George was much more communal, shall we say. All right, let's see, I'm still on the sea sled. Well, let me get to this guy. In 1922, Yale University came west and talked to this man who was coach at UW and offered him the job at Yale, said, we'd like you to come to Yale. This man was Edwin Leader. And please come to Yale. And of course, Yale could pay a lot more than UW. And he said, I will come east on one condition, that one of the Pococks come with me. And they talked about it, and Dick said, I'll go. You know, as I told you, he was newly married, started a family. And so that is how our family got from Washington to New Haven. And I grew up in Milford, Connecticut, just outside of New Haven, where my grandfather settled. He sold his Boeing stock and he built himself a very nice house there in Milford, Connecticut. His contract with Yale was to build 1 8 per year. That was it. It was a non-compete clause, though. He couldn't build for anybody else. He could build small boats if he wanted, but only 8s he could build for Yale. And some of his output was 46 8s. He numbered them. He never had a name on any one of his boats, but they were all numbered 1 through 46. And the story that has been long told on our side of the family, and actually the Washington people, our side over there, believe it and tell the same story. The reason George's business in Seattle took off and all the colleges in the country were ordering Pocock-built boats was that Yale went undefeated from 1922 to 1927. Soon as Dick Pocock came and started building boats for Yale, it was such a superior boat to everything else on the river. They said, where can we get one of these? There was only one place in the country, and that was in Seattle from Dick's brother, George. So we feel that we built, he's got the Boeing stock, but we built his business. In 1924, Yale went to the Olympics in Paris. This was the Eric Liddell Olympics, if you remember Chariots of Fire. And they won the gold medal there. And Dick is in the back, third from the left. In this crew was some of you might know the name Benjamin Spock. He wrote a famous book on baby and child care. He was number 7 seat on that gold medal winner. This was the captain. This is James Stillman Rockefeller. He died a couple of years ago, Greenwich, Connecticut, 102 years old, the oldest gold medal winner. This shows you the popularity of the sport of rowing. The captain of the Yale crew, winner of the gold medal, he's on the cover of Time magazine. All right? This guy went on to found Citibank. Okay? He was pretty successful, but he was most proud of his rowing. In fact, my brother met him, something in New Haven, found out he was a Pocock, grandson of Dick Pocock, took him all the way to Greenwich, took him upstairs into his house, into his private rowing memorabilia, all the stuff all over the walls. So this, you know, time 95-year-old guy showing my brother all this Yale stuff from 1924. So this is George. In the 1940s, 1950s, every single boat on the river, every college was made by George Pocock, except for Yale's, made by Dick Pocock. And so this is what he did. This is Western red cedar. George called this the wood eternal, heavenly wood. He would pray. When he found this, it changed his philosophy of boat making. They were lighter, they were stronger, they were more buoyant, they had a tensile strength to them, a lot lighter. Before this, all they were used for was shingles, was roofing shingles. But, and Dick, George was the innovator, Dick was the late adopter, shall we say. Dick kept building mahogany boats years after George, and finally George convinced him, you know, build these things, and he would send them big 30-foot blocks through the Panama Canal, ship them to New Haven. And they would cut them, he would cut them down to 5/32 of an inch in a mill, and then Dick would hand plane them, and I have one of his planes, it's this long. He would hand plane them down to 3/32 of an inch, and then steam them, two adjacent pieces that were cut, he would steam them, and so you could build a ribless boat. And I'm sure that a lot of you old-timers have rowed in those boats, and how many have put a foot through one of those boats, right? Yeah, that has often been done. This is a record of the Olympic gold medals won by the United States of America from 1920 to 1956. Every single gold medal in consecutive Olympics won, all of them in Pocock boats. This says something about the superiority of the equipment, the best in the world. And all together, Pocock gold medal winning boats, including the smaller boats, 21 of them. And I don't know of any other Olympic record that's anything like that. Wooden boats, of course, kind of went out by roughly about 1980. You know, the fiberglass first, now carbon fiber today, you know, they're lighter. But the wooden boats they're heavier, and they were the best. The Pococks were the best. This is a picture of the 1936 crew. I believe this picture is in the book. They would have reunions every 10 years, so this is plus 40 years. And this is a picture of the end of the race. A story not told in the book. Of course, Brown does a wonderful job of telling the beginning of this race and the disadvantaged lane that the US was giving. Fastest time in the qualifiers, but they were given the worst lane, and the best lanes were given to Germany and Italy, the most protected. So they were out there in the chop and in the wind, and the cocks had to steer 5 degrees off to try just to go down straight down the middle of the lane. So they had a terrible disadvantage. But I heard George say this many times. He said the last 500 meters of the race was protected water in lane 6, and the only crew to have it was Washington. And there was a natural berm in the earth, the last 500 meters, and on top of that berm was built the stands. There were 75,000 people in those stands. And you can see the pennants, they're blowing towards us. And so the wind, whatever wind there was in lane 1 and 2. And George said that protected water for 500 meters was worth at least 5 seconds. And they won by 0.6 of a second over Italy. This is a picture of the Husky Clipper, which now hangs in the Conibear Shell House in Washington. That's just open to the public, so next time you're in Seattle, go see the boat. There it is, and there's a little detail. beautiful woodwork. If you've rode in one of those, you can just smell it, can't you, as you get down in there? Put your feet in those stretchers. This is a picture of Joe Rance's letter sweater. It's hanging up in the boathouse. There's a picture of Joe Rance with his gold medal just before he died. And that's a picture of George also. And look at that guy. He's in a boathouse, he's working. He's got a top hat on, he's got a tie and a vest. I'll tell you, these were proper Englishmen. And my grandfather would go to work. He would work by himself, essentially, most of the time in Yale, a boathouse on the New Haven Harbor. He would go to work every day with a khaki shirt, khaki pants, and a khaki tie tucked in like this. It's just the way you did it. That's the way you did it. There's a picture of my grandfather, Dick. Looks just like the guy that I knew and loved. This is a picture of the Adley Boathouse in New Haven. This is where Yale rowed until 1923. Ed Leader moved them to Derby, where they row now. And this was my grandfather's workshop up until 1964. This boathouse was torn down for the 95 bridge, that new bridge in New Haven. It was torn down in 07, but is now being rebuilt by the Department of Transportation. It's going to be a public boathouse. This is a famous picture in our family. You know, we always have these picnics when George came east, and that was just a year before my grandfather died. And that's Jew, Auntie Jew. And the famous thing in our family was that's a caption contest. So what's she whispering out of the side of her mouth about these two cronies? And I just put this one in. This is a picture of my dad, 18 years old. That's a pencil oar, right? This is in a wooden mahogany shell built by his dad, my grandfather, in 1944. And he won a race. This is on the school kill. He just won a junior sculling event. And we still have that boat. My brother has that down in Guilford, Connecticut right now. Still seaworthy. So far as we know, that is the only wooden Dick Pocock boat still in existence. That's Stan Pocock. Some of you folks know Stan is George's son. George maintained he was a better boat builder, went to school for engineering, but said, I prefer building boats. He himself was a great oarsman and a coach. He was an Olympic coach. He coached a gold medal winning four in the 1960 Rome Olympics, a boat that he built and then coached. Interesting thing about it is when they got back with this gold medal winning boat, he sold it to a rowing club who wanted to buy it, but they never paid. And so he was just like his dad, you know, pay me when you can. And they never paid. 45 years later, there's a fellow up in Port Townsend, Washington right now collecting old Pocock wooden boats, and he's refurbishing them. There's quite a collection. If you ever get out to the Olympic Peninsula, go check it out. And he was looking for a four, and Stan, who was you know, in his upper 80s, a few years ago, he said, oh, I know where there's one. And he remembered this club, and this thing was all broken down. It was way up in the racks. And he went out and he says, you know, you never paid me for this 45 years ago. I'm here to repossess it. And so he took it and gave it to the guy up there in the Olympic Peninsula. And now it's been rehabbed, and so you can go row that Olympic gold medal winning four. Here's the book that Chris told us about, Ready All. It's George Yeoman Pocock's name misspelled right on the cover, but this is a second release. You can buy that in paperback. The first edition is here in hardcover. And here is Stan Pocock's memoirs, Way Enough, and non-rower, right? They didn't spell way correctly. And that's kind of a coffee table book. Here is, I told you about the documentary. PBS has made a documentary, and it'll be released on August 2nd. I talked to, you know, the Olympic, right up here in Concord, Bill Becklean lives. He was the coxswain of the 1956 Yale gold medal winning crew. And he was in Boston the other day seeing a screening of this. It has just been, you know, pre-screening. He said it's magnificent. So watch that on PBS in conjunction with the Olympics. And here is a final picture of George. So I'm going to open it up to some comments or questions, or maybe you've got some stories. Before I do, I want to answer a question that has been asked me several times, because a lot of you are my friends, some people from this church. So I'm going to answer this question once here in 60 seconds, so I don't have to answer it 50 times later. What am I doing now? Here's what I'm doing. As Chris said, I'm working for Gordon College. That's my day job. My night job, what I'm doing evenings and weekends, is I am now the co-founder and president of Elevate New England. It's a nonprofit that we have started. We've got several people on our board, and we're beginning operations in July. This works in the area of the failure of urban public schools to graduate their students. National average, 56%. We put privately funded teacher mentors in the public school teaching a course in character formation, things like goal setting, punctuality, follow through. And then after school, these same teacher mentors become essentially like urban youth workers, building the relationships to help these students succeed. And graduation rate among our students is well over 95%. So it's a program that yeah. So that's what I'm doing. And it's a program that actually I found in Denver. It's been running for 33 years. It's been replicated in Orlando and Phoenix and Indianapolis and the Bronx. We're bringing it to Boston. And we're going to start it. We're going to pioneer. Our first pioneer is going to be in Lowell. Then we will go to other cities and to Boston quickly. If you want to find out more about it, I got a brochure on the back table. And if you want to get on the mailing list, sign up. And if you want to support it, talk to me, because we need donors. All right, so any questions, comments that you may have? Yes, ma'am.
Did you row?
You know, I rowed recreationally. My story is, I went to prep school down in New Haven, and when I was applying to colleges, the football coach at Bucknell called me and said, "Come and play for us, you're going to transform our program." I believed him, actually. I was 17 years old, you know. And I got there and I found out that's what he says to everybody. So I went and played. So I rowed recreationally. I was in the New Haven Rowing Club when I was in high school. But my sport was rugby. I kind of dropped out of football and played rugby, and I played 10 seasons, and I actually had a trial with the national team, so that was my passion. George was the boatman too. He built all the boats for the entire fleet in '56. That was Yale's choice, I guess, to run it, and George, not Dick, went to Melbourne for that. That was it. Well, it was the generation before Aaron Frederick Pocock. In fact, you know, I told you I was down in Gale's Ferry with the Yale crew yesterday. And I'll tell you, you could spend a whole day reading the clippings that are on the wall in these old pictures. So I found a story written by my grandfather in the 40s on the history of rowing in England. And it was published, and unfortunately it said continued on page 46, but there was no page 40. You know, I read that. But he talked about racing shells that he knew being built in his family in 1823. So, and Stan would talk about, in fact, both George and Stan, I knew Stan really well. Stan died about 3 years ago at age 90. And he and my dad, you know, first cousins, they would correspond all the time. But Stan and George would talk about rowing every day, all day long for their entire career. They would be up there building boats together, talking about rowing, talking about the building of the boats and whatever. I had fascinating conversations with Bill Beckling, you know, this Cox I mentioned. He drove me down to London yesterday and back, talking all the way down and back. And I asked him the question, I mean, who's a coxswain here? I know there's several coxswains. So I asked him the question that every coxswain wants to hear. What difference does a good coxswain make in a boat? How can a good coxswain win? And He said, let me tell you. And he said there's 4 points, and he actually talks about how he teaches it. But where was I going with this? Oh, he said rowing is psychological. He said at the top level, you figure everybody is the same physical. They've got the same conditioning. They have pushed themselves as far as a human body can go. He said, so the winner is going to be the one that's psychologically superior. And that's where the coxswain comes in. And Stan would tell these stories as a coach about trying to get a psychological edge. He told me one story about coaching Washington lightweights. They went down to Cal, and they knew that the Cal boat was faster, and they knew the Navy boat was faster. They were the third best crew on the river. Stan said to them, he said, if you guys are going to win, you've got to figure something out psychological. And he just gave that. And his coxswain, they got out, they ran halfway through the race. They're down by a length. And the coxswain says, okay, Washington, in 3 strokes, we take it up to full slide. And the other boats all heard that, and they just completely broke down. Washington won easily. So the psychological game. But this is the kind of stuff that George and Stan would talk about all day in the shop, building these boats.
In your description of Elevate, I didn't hear you mention any component or introduction to the sport of rowing at all. Have you thought of adding that?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's very similar to what goes on.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So, you know, there's a good youth rowing component up in Lowell, up on the Merrimack River. I mean, you guys all know that. So the fellow that Chris mentioned, our mutual friend Dan Bakanowski, I've talked to him about Elevate, and he was thrilled because he said, oh, this youth rowing is going to be perfect. You know, get these city kids on the river. So we are going to partner in Lowell. They don't know it yet, but we're going to. The thing about Elevate, what we supply in Elevate are the relationships. You know, that we're essentially replacing the missing father in many cases. But we have the relationships because these kids don't have a vision for what they could do. The resources are there. So we'll partner with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with the YMCA, with a dance club, with a artist, you know, thing, and with the youth rowing. And we provide the relationships and the mentoring. They provide, you know, all the physical things to do. So we will do that. Yeah.
Can you know for sure that that was one of Dick's boats?
If that was one of Dick's boats, on the gunnels at the coxswain seat would be a number. So 1 through 46. The Olympic winning boat in 24 was boat number 4. So if you see a number there, that was one of Dick's boats. I'll give you my card after this. I want to hear. Okay, because my belief is that we haven't found one existing Dick Pocock boat.
Did Bill Duckley tell you that when they won the gold medal in Melbourne, that the boat actually went up on the bank and didn't break?
No.
That's what it did.
Yeah,
That's how the race calls.
those Pococks are magic, I'll tell you. No, but I'll tell you, I gave this talk where I met Bill a couple of months ago. It was up at the Essex County Club. I was the after-dinner speaker, and I had no idea that somebody was bringing this guy. But he got up, and boy, did he tell some great stories about that. Because Yale had to come back. They won the repechage. They had to come back through and 60 years ago. And he still carries his gold medal around. I had him yesterday. He was flashing it to all the Yale guys. Somebody back here, yeah.
Do you think that the use of composite materials now has changed rowing in a parallel way? The way golf has changed with the use of titanium, and suddenly courses are outmoded because of 350-yard drives and so on?
Yeah, all the wooden boat people really lament that first it was fiberglass, then composite, now carbon fiber now. But we have a friend, Beth and I have a friend who rowed for University of Washington in 1980, national championship crew. So in the next year, the crew was essentially the same. They went down to Cal in a wooden Pocock boat, to row against a Cal crew that they knew they were a better crew. But Cal was in a fiberglass boat, brand new from Germany. And Cal beat them by a length. And this guy said, we all knew that was the end of wooden boats. They're lighter. I actually told that story in response to the same question that was asked at Yale yesterday. And I told that story. And in the back of the room, Steve Gladstone, the coach at Yale, just laughed. And he said, I was the coach of that Cal crew. And he knew that he could find a fiberglass 8 that was imported one place in the country, in Biddeford, Maine. And he got it all the way across the country. And yeah, and he won. He's a tremendous coach. All right, well, I'll be here as long as you have questions. And Chris, thank you very much for setting this thing up, and Wayland-Weston crew, do a great job next year. Congratulations on your good history, and great to see you.